All right, so excited to talk to you all today. This might be a little different, not really explicitly brain aging stuff, but talking about a life course perspective and the advantages of a life course perspective for thinking about discrimination and its impacts on health. So a little bit about me. Maybe I should start at the bottom. So I'm not an aging or dementia researcher, not a neuroscientist at all. I'm a developmental scientist. Did all my training in the States, and then this is my second year at McGill in the psych department here. But really, my research is about understanding the impacts of discrimination, other types of racialized stressors on health and well-being of minoritized youth and families. And more importantly than that, really looking at resilience factors related to kind of cultural identity, values, traditions, other things like anti-racist activism that might protect youth and families against the negative impacts of discrimination. So generally just going to try to talk about kind of a life course perspective, give some examples of how this might, how this can be used to think about discrimination and stress impacting health, and hopefully be able to make some connections to the work that you all do. All right. So I used to give more information about this, but I think we're at this point in society now where I can just say discrimination is bad. It's associated with like any negative outcome you can think of and less of many of the positive outcomes you might care about. But I think a life course perspective is really kind of interesting and can add a lot to understanding the impacts of discrimination on health across the lifespan. So just kind of broadly, life course perspective is again thinking about individual, social, contextual, and even historical factors that impact individuals across their entire lifespan, across different developmental stages. So really the focus is on change over time and change as kind of the norm rather than the exception to the norm. And kind of the main thesis being that research on racism, discrimination, stress, and health can benefit from adopting more of a life course perspective. There are a couple kind of main concepts or tenets of life course perspectives. I'm just going to talk about three that I think might be particularly relevant in this context and give kind of examples of each, with those kind of main ones being age pattern exposures, sensitive periods in development, and then an idea about latency periods. But happy to talk about others and questions if people are curious. When we think about age pattern exposures, it's way blurrier than it was supposed to be. Really thinking about how exposure to things like stress or just exposure to different factors in your context may change as a function of age. So this idea that people move in and out of different contexts across development. For example, for the first 20, maybe 25 years of your life, maybe 30 for many of us, you're in these academic institutions and academic settings, right? And you might have certain exposures to protective factors, but also stressors based on the time that you spend in these institutions. People then often transition out in emerging adulthood and are in more work settings. The way that you interact and the way that you're situated in kind of occupational hierarchies changes over time. And this moving in and out of different contexts might lead to differential exposure to stress or differential exposure to discrimination. One kind of example comes from work of Gilbert G, just trying to look at how age-based discrimination changes across time in a sample of kind of women in the workforce. This is a nationally representative, huge sample of women in the 70s till the 80s, followed over time, and looking at the discrimination experienced by kind of younger women, 14 to 24 at baseline, and then kind of women in like established adulthood, 30 to 40. And really this kind of age pattern exposure shows that if you stretch out and you combine those cohorts and look longitudinally at exposure to this age-based discrimination across a really wide swath of development, so age 20 up till close to 70, you can see these really stark differences in exposure to discrimination, where women are facing high levels of kind of ageism in their early 20s, goes down, and there seems to be a peak in the 50s. And you can imagine the impacts of discrimination on health and well-being might be more profound the more stress you're actually experiencing, right? So I think it really shows the kind of importance of thinking of these age-patterned exposures and the fact that stress may not be equally distributed across the life course. It's another, I think, really important idea of sensitive periods. So this idea that certain events have a more substantial impact on health during certain periods of development versus others. Some of you all may be familiar with this idea of sensitive periods in like fetal development during certain weeks during gestation, certain parts of the body, neural tube are developing, and then assaults to like a developing child during certain times may lead to like problems with that part of the body that's developing. But I think sensitive periods occur throughout the lifespan and for lots of different things, right? Um, and there may be particular times in development where stressors like discrimination might exert a bigger impact on outcomes we care about than others. So we should really kind of think about these age by stress exposure interactions. It's a little bit of kind of broad work on this. This is an example of kind of an empirically derived model of likelihood for an onset of a depressive disorder based on age and the type of stress you're exposed to. You can see here this kind of circled green area that all negative life events empirically have been shown to lead to the greatest risk of onset for a depressive disorder in this midlife period in the 40s and 50s. And you can see, depending on the type of stress you care about, your onset of a major depressive episode or risk for onset might differ, right? So if we're thinking about something like depression, maybe we think that stress, there may be a sensitive period for stressors in midlife, for example. I'll just show you a quick study that I did kind of looking at that using the MIDAS data sets of midlife in the United States, a big national data set of adults who are between ages 20 and 49 at wave one. So we have a big kind of age range, again, similar to the G study. You can see this is really not a very diverse sample to go with the previous talk about weird samples, so that you can correct for this in some ways. But again, looking at discrimination in each of these three waves, each of which were assessed 10 years apart. So thinking about everyday discrimination, most of which was gender-based, thinking about shift and persist, not really important for this, but is a kind of coping strategy, and then depressive symptoms. And what you can do if you have these kind of longitudinal data sets and you have lots of different ages represented is you can do what's called a accelerated longitudinal design. So kind of traditionally, we think about longitudinal work. How do things change from wave to wave? In the case of MIDAS, waves are 10 years apart. So at wave one, people are 20, wave three, they're 40s. We also have people in their 30s at wave one who are 50 at wave two, people in their 40s at wave one who are in their 60s at wave three. All well and good, but if we're thinking about both age pattern exposures, the fact that stress may differ in frequency by age, and we're thinking about development, right? You might surmise that the trajectory of someone's kind of level of depression across their life is different between 20 and 40 as it is between 40 and 60. So if we're just looking at change from wave to wave, we're really kind of compressing the differences that might occur across development. So you can do an accelerated longitudinal design or cohort sequential design, you call it. Instead of looking at change from wave to wave, you can kind of flip your data on its head and instead look at changes across ages in different cohorts. So instead of looking just at change in depression over 20 years, you can look at how does depression evolve from the 20s, the earliest age we have represented in the data, all the way through the 60s, the oldest age we have represented at that last time point. And you can use that to try and identify different sensitive periods. So in this study, just generally found this slightward downward trajectory in depressive symptoms from the 20s through the 60s. But when we looked at discrimination during each decade of life, we saw that discrimination led to a kind of peak in depression over and above what you would expect based on that general downward trajectory. So you would expect your depressive symptoms to go down a certain amount each decade of life. If you face discrimination, they may actually go up relative to those who didn't report depression over that time span. But in line with this idea of sensitive periods, found that shift and persist coping, which is really the style of coping characterized by cognitively reappraising stress, accepting it, and kind of looking towards more positive things in the future, maintaining this sense of meaning and purpose in life. Protected against discrimination during the 30s specifically. So maybe there's a sensitive period where a protective factor, a coping factor, is having more of an important impact during this decade of life than during others. Similarly, we also found, again, a kind of increased risk in the midlife period, where discrimination that participants reported in their 40s was predictive of greater depression a full decade later in their 50s. But again, during that period, people that engaged in this higher level of shift and persist coping during this decade of life didn't show that lagged 10-year prospective impact of discrimination on depressive symptoms. So I think this is just an example to show how accelerated longitudinal designs and sensitive periods can really be used to think more, I think, have a more refined way of thinking about age-based exposures and kind of periods at which risk factors and protective factors may have a stronger or weaker impact on health and well-being. Right. My final thing that I'll talk about is this life course perspective concept of latency periods, which is the idea that there is in sometimes a period between exposure to a stressor and the actual manifestation of difficulties coming from that stressor, right? Seems pretty apparent to people. But this can happen for things like racism and discrimination as well. So in a study of women in the workplace, finds that discrimination isn't associated with psychological distress 7 years later. So in this sample, the psychological impacts of discrimination weren't extending that far in time, but it was associated with kind of functional physical impairments. But by contrast, discrimination experienced at that 7-year follow-up was associated with psychological functioning, but wasn't associated with impairments. This is implying that the kind of functional physical health impacts of discrimination may take some time to set in. They're maybe not as apparent acutely, but if we look at people across enough time, they show up. Right? This is my one brain-based thing that I included. This does connect, if we think about kind of models of neurobiological impacts of discrimination on health. It's a good resource if you all are interested. Discrimination has a lot of impacts on brain-based processes, but they may not just be apparent immediately. Oops, my thing stopped moving. Oh. All right, we're good. When we think about all of these different concepts, they all kind of feed together, right? I'll just end with one study. This is in kids, but study looking at discrimination, depression, anxiety in a sample of Mexican origin kids from the California Families Project, studied yearly from 5th to 12th grade. We're really interested in how kind of baseline levels of peer discrimination, as well as changes from year to year, were related with later outcomes here at the end of high school. Generally, what we found, this graph shows the kind of dark line is the overall kind of trajectory of discrimination across time, and each of those individual lines are an individual person's reports across those years of school. So you see there's a lot of variability in how much discrimination people report across time. So even looking at same-aged kids, there's still a lot of variability that's important to consider. We found that 5th grade discrimination is related to depressive and anxiety symptoms a full 7 years later, which is like pretty sad, honestly. We also found this idea both for latency and these potential sensitive periods again, where increases in discrimination between 7th and 8th grade, as well as increases between 9th and 10th grade, were associated with 12th grade anxiety, but not depression. So again, and these years happen to correspond to years not during the school transition from like elementary to middle or middle to high school, but the year following. So there might be something special going on there after you've established in a new school that's leading to greater anxiety many years later. So again, I think these are just kind of general examples that hopefully have communicated that I think a life course perspective can add a lot of value to studying health and development of kind of health across the lifespan. But I think we need a lot more, again, thinking about trajectories of stress exposure over time, being more sensitive to age than we are just the passage of time. Trying to identify these different sensitive periods, not only for risk factors, but also for protective factors. And then if we can identify those periods where risks are at their highest and protective factors are at their most potent, those are times that we can intervene and actually move the needle to push people towards more healthy development. So that's all I got. Thank you all.